So, the Hillsborough Stadium disaster remains the worst catastrophe in British sporting history.
He's got one.
Yet it was preceded by a remarkably similar, yet much less widely known event that occurred in Bolton in 1946, football's forgotten disaster. So the conclusion of the Second World War coincided with a rapid growth in the popularity of football across Britain. After 6 years of fear and uncertainty, the public were eager to engage in any form of leisure or entertainment that would provide a brief break from the grim reality of post-war life. For the working class man, football became the cheapest and most viable option, with attendances in the mid-1940s reaching an all-time high. However, football had been left badly scarred by the hardships of war. Many of the stadiums had fallen into neglect, suffered damage from German bombing raids, or been procured by national organisations to aid the war effort. For example, Bramall Lane was partly destroyed by German bombs, and Stoke City's Victoria Ground was converted into an air raid shelter. Now, Burnden Park personified the poor state of many sporting grounds in the immediate aftermath of the war. The stadium stood in the southern reaches of the city and was surrounded by endless rows of terraced houses and was rudimentary in design. The railway embankment behind the north goal was little more than a mound of dirt. Crush barriers were installed on the terracing and acted as the only safety mechanism to control the movement of the crowd during the game. The stadium was later described as a crumbling death trap, and like many other sports clubs at the time, Bolton lacked the financial resources to renovate their facilities in the austerity of post-war Britain. 9th of March 1946, Burnden Park was a thriving hive of activity as Bolton Wanderers prepared to take on Stoke City in the FA Cup quarter-final second leg. The home team were favourites to progress, and the Stoke team included Stanley Matthews, a player of renowned prestige who was said to attract an extra 10,000 spectators in every game he appeared. A bumper crowd of 50,000 was expected. Burnden Park's official capacity was 65,000. Yet, in reality, over 85,000 supporters were present inside and outside the ground on the day. Over 2,000 spectators were permitted access to the railway embankment alone. At 2:40 p.m, the police closed the turnstiles and declared the stadium officially full. Many of the 15,000 spectators who were left outside the ground resigned themselves to missing the match. However, there were others that sought to gain illegal entry. Some climbed over closed turnstiles, whilst others forced holes in the external fencing. But inside Burnden Park, conditions were already cramped and uncomfortable. In the railway embankment, one spectator, in attendance with his young son, forced open a fire escape so he could leave the ground. However, as they made their exit, they left the gate open, which allowed hundreds of supporters locked outside to force their way in and onto the already packed terracing. The arrival of the two teams at 3 p.m. was met with great excitement amongst the spectators, as a chance to see their playing idols in action. The game kicked off with everyone present completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Dramatic pause. On the railway embankment, the arrival of hundreds more spectators through the open fire escape generated such a force that one of the crush barriers was flattened, and people were pushed helplessly forward into the resulting breach and gap. The poor design of the terracing created a natural funnel, or bottleneck. Hundreds of people were compressed into the gap, tumbling forwards, bodies piling one upon the next. Some were crushed, others trampled underfoot. Hundreds, maybe thousands of spectators started to pour onto the field of play in a desperate attempt to escape the resulting crush. The game continued, briefly, as police desperately attempted to make sense of the situation and regain some semblance of order. The seriousness of the situation was unclear. Was it crowd disorder? Were there injuries? The chaos and lack of phone lines inside the stadium made it hard to decipher. Motionless casualties started to be removed from the railway embankment. At first, just one or two, but soon the mounting list became so significant that volunteers from the crowd began to offer their services for help. As spectators continued to pour onto the pitch, the match official halted the game and took the two teams into the dressing rooms. Casualties were laid out in front of the main stand and along the touchline. At first, it was thought the supporters had fainted, but it soon began to dawn that the injuries sustained were much more severe and serious. On the pitch, only the arrival of two mounted police officers started to bring order to the confused crowd. The Chief Constable of Bolton was made aware that there had been at least one death. He decided that to abandon the game would result in more panic and ordered the contest to be resumed. With no more room on the terracing, fresh lines were made out of sawdust to allow for the overspill of spectators. The match continued, but all the time casualties were being brought to in front of the main stand and motionless bodies were lying by the side of the pitch. There was no half-time and the two teams immediately disappeared when the final whistle sounded. Many spectators actually left the ground completely unaware of what had unfolded, assuming those injured to have fainted. 33 people lost their lives on the day and a further 500 were injured. At the time, it was the worst sporting disaster on British soil. The Home Secretary ordered an immediate inquiry to be led by R. Martyn Hughes. All the relevant authorities assured that they would work together to ensure that such a disaster would never occur again. The Mayor of Bolton set up a relief fund with players and supporters from across the country, raising over £52,000 for the families of the victims. The Hughes report came to three conclusions. One, that there were too many spectators that had been allowed entry into the stadium. Two, that the poor design of the railway embankment helped to create a deadly bottleneck. And thirdly, that the unauthorised entry of spectators played a key role. The report also made numerous suggestions aimed at controlling crowd sizes and stadium safety. However, these were taken up by local authorities and football clubs, mostly on a voluntary basis. Very little immediate voluntary action was taken. Just 4 days after 33 spectators had died in the stadium, it was open for business as usual. The Burnden Park Stadium disaster preceded further tragedies at Ibrox, Bradford and Heysel. It was not until 43 years later and the events at Hillsborough that significant changes were proceeded in British football.
Takes some confidence to do that without actually looking at the screen, Martyn. Nice one. Just assuming it's all okay. Yeah, Bob.
Thanks, good. The embankment remained in operation until certainly the end of the 1960s and possibly beyond, looking very much like that. So, did the football club do anything at all to make it safer, or did they just reconstruct it as it was and take the chances?
To my knowledge, there were no major developments. They tried to improve the crush barriers. They repaired the damage that was made during the disaster, but they didn't make any major amendments. Just 4 days later, the stadium's open again, with no real amendments or differences. So it wasn't so much later that actually the idea of the crush barriers and crowd safety and terracing actually came to the fore again. Changes made.
Paul?
I was interested in your comment that the clubs couldn't afford to develop the stadium because of post-war austerity. Was that really true? Because the football clubs themselves were booming. These were like the highest attendances ever that they were getting. So, again, it's a small question in the sense that what responsibility did the club have, do you think, for this disaster?
Which is a great question, because the Hughes report and the actions of the Home Secretary sort of passed the blame towards supporters. There's very little accountability for the club, or the local authorities, or the police. And yet, you're absolutely right that football clubs have a choice. Do they improve facilities with booming crowds, or do they get the players in and spend it on playing staff for success? I guess that's something I could look into in much more detail further on. It's hard to say really, but I definitely take your point that the clubs were booming, big attendances. Was there money being spent on players which would have been spent on ground safety and facilities? It's a good question to ask.
I'll take Lisa first.
I was just wondering, I probably don't know as much about the other three in the middle of these, but I'm wondering whether you think that Hillsborough had the effect it did because of this cumulative bit, or whether it was just to do with the contemporary times, like whether you got closer towards health and safety culture in Hillsborough, or whether it's because you had the number that now means you can't do number anymore.
It might have been a combination. I sense it was more because it was more widely seen with Hillsborough in terms of TV, in terms of coverage. If you look at the newspapers sitting here in Stoke, the Burnden Park disaster, after the first 2 days, wasn't mentioned again until the Hughes report came out. and after that it wasn't mentioned again since. It was very quickly, certainly in this area, swept under the carpet a little bit and pushed to one side. I think with Hillsborough, the similarities are very similar, remarkably similar in terms of a gate being opened, fans coming in, overcrowding, and the reaction and response to it. I just think that the Hillsborough, the Bradford disaster, things like that have gained more, not popularity, but more knowledge about them simply because of the coverage that they got, or increased coverage in comparison.
Jen?
Yeah. I was wondering, so after the Hillsborough disaster, you had, family members of the victims who were very active in claiming justice for what happened there. I wonder if there's anything you know about the victims' families at Burnden Park.
Yeah, I haven't found anything that suggests that they actually sought justice, so to speak, in the same way. Perhaps because this was quite common in terms of large crowds, things often got quite crowded, crowd safety and the safety mechanism put in place were just what they were. I haven't found anything to suggest that they openly went forward and sought justice, so to speak.
Well, justice is perhaps
Yes, yeah.
the question,
Yeah. In a way, you could argue they were compensated by the relief fund, very minimally. But I can't find anything yet that suggests that they were after anything more, so to speak. It doesn't mean that they didn't. Perhaps it's something I need to look further into to find something.
Gary?
I'm just wondering, it's a very hot topic, but it's so soon after the Second World War that you think part of the reason why there wasn't such a strong defence is that everybody had suffered loss at some point, that we were more used to death.
Yeah, quite possibly. Quite possibly. Also the case that perhaps as a sport in society, we didn't want to focus on another disaster so soon after the Second World War. But certainly something that could have played a part in that, yes.
We've got Jeff and then Ian.
One of the things about Hillsborough is that the identity of the victims, and you can sort of empathise with them, with their families. Was there anything similar in terms of the identities of the victims of this disaster as well? In the sense that were their names published in the paper? Or?
Yes, the names were published. But that was about it. In terms of sort of recognition now, Bolton do an awful lot as a football club to sort of raise awareness about them. We have a minute silence and Memorial Day. Stoke do nothing. We have a minute silence for Hillsborough, but the tragedy and disaster we were involved in, so to speak, we do nothing for. And it's quite poignant to me that when I first wrote an article for Plain Pasts on Burnden Park, I spoke about Stoke City websites and fan sites, and no one knew about it. No one was really aware. It was just something they might have heard of in the past. So it really struck me that such a narrative and story, of so many similarities to Hillsborough, is so not very well known nationally.
Yeah?
I just wondered about the ownership structure of the club, the board, the local businessmen represented on there, their links with the police, senior policemen, their links with senior civic personalities and so on, and whether, that it's such, in that day and age, it was such a closed shop, as it were, around Bolton, that they certainly would be in a stronger position, particularly given no particular intrusive media interest like would have happened later, that it was, generally one of these things that had there been a move locally to do something about it, they would have been able to close ranks and resist the notion of blame or compensation or anything like that, or even response.
Yeah. This piece of work was in fact a piece of undergraduate work I did, and this is why I got interested in sports history. And I've kept adding to it over time. That aspect of it isn't something I've considered before. If there was links between club ownership and police forces or response, whatever it may be. Well, that would be something really interesting to look at, definitely. To see if there were connections, to see if perhaps it was a closed shop, as you say. I would definitely take that on board and look at that in the future.
Okay, we have to finish there. Thank you, Martyn.